young people require feedback, they require development, and that's great. But if you're going to be maybe in the office, you're permanently remote, so 0 days in the office or 1 or 2 days, right? That's not enough time for them to get the mentorship, the development, the feedback, all the things that they need to potentially be successful. Welcome to the Wellable Weekly Podcast, where we talk about key topics and trends at the intersection of well-being, technology, and HR. I'm Nick, along here with my good friend and colleague, Geoff. Geoff, how are you doing?
Happy Friday, Nick. Summer is
Happy
here,
Friday.
or almost here.
Yeah, it's 100% summer in Boston, for those of you who are curious about the Boston weather. It's a good Friday. And for those who don't know about our company, we do like a summer Fridays thing. So we're recording this Friday morning, but every between Memorial Day and Labor Day, we do a half day, everyone in the company. It's a good opportunity to get out and kind of enjoy the summer a little bit early on every week. All right. So this Wellbe Weekly, we're going to focus the podcast on one article. And I think just honestly, there's just so much to talk about. Like we're going to probably have to work just to keep the topic itself, even though it's just one single topic, a little bit tight here. But there's an article out in Fortune that effectively said that like this whole Gen Z hiring nightmare. So for those of you who aren't aware, recent graduates, so like largely Gen Z. So I think they defined it as 22 to 27 years old. So, 5 years out of college-ish or less, are just dealing with a higher unemployment. This is really, really hard to get a job. So for context, the unemployment rate is 5.6% in March. That's higher just than the general unemployment rate, which was 4.2% at the same time. And it's also just higher, more materially, than just older degree holders, right? So, which is around 3.1%. So there's a big just consternation. And I think you can see that in a lot of booing that we discussed that happened in commencement speeches at a previous
Exactly.
podcast. Yeah, people were booing, any talk of AI because the narrative is that AI is what's driving this just really challenging job market in general and a really challenging job market specifically for young people in Gen Z. But there's some new research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that effectively just kind of countering that argument. And they're saying, the real cause of this hiring crisis, if you will, for Gen Z is remote work.
Yeah, I think the number from the article is that 64% of the rise in youth unemployment traces back to remote eligible fields, right? I mean, that's a pretty stunning number. And certainly when you hear that statistic, the common narrative of how so much of the challenges that new grads are facing is directly tied to this rise of AI and the limited opportunities they have in entry level roles, especially in that kind of software knowledge worker fields. It kind of flips that a bit, right? So I think it's not to say that this is the we should redirect our angst and consternation towards remote jobs, right? But I mean, certainly if you kind of follow the logic of this research paper, there's a lot to be said for that drastic change in how we worked late 2019 into early 2020 and beyond on the availability of jobs and also just like development, right, of new hires in the workforce.
Yeah, I think the term they use, I'm not sure if this even is a real word, is a new word for me, but they use the term remotable fields in the research
Yeah,
paper. If it's a Federal Reserve Bank of New York, I'm going to say it's a real word, right? And I'm going to start
yeah.
using it. But they're effectively talking, I think they listed some, like, software engineering, financial analysis, just all these white collar jobs. And like, it's easy to think when you read the list of the jobs they are talking about, this is an AI story, and they directly tackle that kind of narrative. Um, One, I think there's a ton of research, right, just out there in general. There's a lot of people who say, despite what companies are saying about AI as the rationale for job loss, there's really no evidence that like AI today, not to say in the future, it wouldn't happen, is displacing jobs materially today. And you kind of listed that 64% number, but another stat that the research paper kind of pointed to was looking at unemployment rates for college graduates less than 29 years old and greater than 29 years old. And so during this kind of post-COVID period, the unemployment rate for less than 29 increased from 3.1% to 3.7% over the last 9 years, right? So I guess a little bit before COVID too.
Yeah.
And over that same period, the unemployment rate for people who are just a little bit more experienced, 29 years or older, actually went down from 1.9% to
Mm.
1.8%. So largely flat, slightly down. But their argument would be AI is not like so young that it's good enough to take a 25-year-old's job, but not good enough to take a
Hmm.
32-year-old job. And the fact that
Right.
you're seeing this difference just by age is a factor. And so the question I think everyone's probably thinking is like, well, why does age have to do with remote work? And I think part of
Mm.
it is younger employees are more desiring of remote work, right? And many of them grew up in a world where like they started their job and they're just 100% remote. Like they haven't even
Hmm.
experienced having being asked to come into the office. But then the other piece is just feedback, right? Like younger
Yeah.
employees need more feedback and need more development.
Yeah, I mean, I think the article uses the word, a pretty strong term, scarring effects, to describe what flexible or more remote work can do to young graduates or just early in career people's development. I mean, that's obviously pretty strong when you think about what is really a formative time for someone who's coming out of college in their first job, or just in that maybe first couple of years of work. And I just even remember my experience starting in a kind of a rotational program, getting to see a lot of different parts of a business, and just so much like on the job training, shadowing. You don't even know what you don't know at that point. So if you are in an environment where much of your time, or all of your time, if you're in a full remote job, but let's just say for argument's sake, you're in a hybrid, right, which is what most of companies are in today, where 2 or 3 days of your week you're by yourself and getting limited exposure to your manager or just to more experienced people at the company that you can just listen to, absorb information, ask questions, some good, maybe some not. But when you're that early in your career, again, there really shouldn't be too many questions that are off limits. That's just so it's formative, right? In terms of building confidence, building a skill set, and not feeling like you're kind of on your own for so much of your workday.
Yeah, and just to be to avoiding doubt, like this wasn't like that term. I think the quote you had was scarring effects, right? Which was referring
Hmm.
to like the impact that remote work's having on the development of young employees, was something that the article was actually quoting another researcher paper that the same
Hmm.
economist wrote. So, that term scarring effects is like actually in the National Bureau of Economic Research. Like that's a published research report that they, I guess scrutinize a little bit more than like maybe a media article or what have you. And
Hmm.
that specific kind of research paper was focusing on the productivity of software engineers at large U.S. firms. And I find software engineering like to be like the perfect example in this moment in time because it feels like that is the number one use case for AI right now, right? You're hearing about Uber and all these companies blowing through in good ways and maybe bad ways tokens for development, and like it seems like the number one use case, which explains why like Anthropic and Claude is like soaring to popularity, is that software engineering seems to be where we're presumably maybe taking away the most jobs. Now, again, I think a lot of people would argue against that. So the number of open software engineering positions is actually increasing and so forth. We can get into to those weeds, but they're looking at software engineers at a large US firm, and they effectively found that like while remote work can improve, output among some people, it's not for everyone. So like remote work can boost output they found for experienced workers, right?
Yeah.
But can actually detriment have a negative impact on young workers, right? So remote work isn't uniformly beneficial or negative necessarily. It depends on where you are. If you're a young employee and you're Gen Z, it's a big impact. And one of the stats they kind of ripped out was the feedback on coding work and feedback, is probably most applicable to young employees, right? Increased
Mm.
by 18.3% when workers were in the office. So another way to think about it is just you're getting materially less feedback if you're working remotely, and that feedback trickles in terms of your performance and all these type of things. And that's the scarring effects that he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a study that was just done for software development and coders, but that number just seems so plausible across any function that you can think of. If anyone's in this type of remote or hybrid environment, right, you can pretty clearly see the impact of how easy it is to come over to somebody's desk and talk about a problem, or you get asked more questions. I certainly get approached more often when I'm in the office on Wednesdays and Thursdays. And again, that's Wellable's kind of approach to this. We've taken our position of having a hybrid model where we have 2 days a week where everybody comes in to our respective offices. So we're maximizing our time in office together. We try to do more collaborative work there. And I certainly noticed that the types of conversations I have on those in-office days, certainly there's some tactical items, right, inevitably, but it definitely skews more towards guidance and a little bit of coaching and hopefully some mentorship, I'd like to think. Whereas on those remote days, which again tend to be Monday, Tuesday, Friday for us, it is highly tactical. It is, taking care of business, trying to rip out projects and tasks and things like that. But it's minimal, nuanced, feedback. You do as much as you can, but you're just limited by the fact that it's largely over Teams and like the occasional call or virtual meeting.
Yeah, this is just anecdotal, but just even take yesterday. Like I think you and I had one formal meeting, like actually on the calendar to meet, but you and I actually met 3 times yesterday, right? And we were collaborating on these 2 projects that are separate, that we were mostly working asynchronously because we were remote during the early part of the week, but now we were in the office, like, hey, Geoff, can you come chat with me really quickly? And we knocked it out. And that just wouldn't have happened if we were like, away from each other, right? It's the one thing I want to kind of maybe come back to is this idea that, like, if you take it at kind of face value, the drop in jobs in general and for Gen Z and younger employees is a function of AI, right? So you have Mark Zuckerberg, you have all these CEOs, right? Jack Dorsey at Block, et cetera, saying AI is changing the way we are working, and we're going to drastically reduce our workforce. We're going to mostly cut, I think, middle management, right? But when you're cutting off 10%, 15, 20% of the workforce, everyone gets touched in some way, right? And I think what the researchers would do, and they would actually, the article would quote that this has been validated across like multiple research papers, right? Is that AI is not, there's no real hard evidence that AI is displacing the workforce. And to stick with the software engineering example, there are more software jobs open today looking to get filled than there were 12 months ago, right? And a lot of code, when it was like really disrupting software engineering, was happening within that 12 months. Another example they gave was like this age gap in hiring actually predates more broadly like mass diffusion of AI tools. That's like the 9-year like look back, et cetera. So AI probably has some impact, you would think, right? But like certainly is not a huge impact, and kind of the study suggests that today. What it really comes down to is that US firms, right, and companies, especially those that have distributed teams that are either partially or fully remote, are just like less willing to hire young people, right? Because young people require feedback, they require development, and that's great. But if you're going to be maybe in the office, you're permanently remote, so 0 days in the office or 1 or 2 days, right? That's not enough time for them to get the mentorship, the development, the feedback, all the things that they need to potentially be successful. And the companies are just saying, you know what, we're trimming middle management, and that's just a general trend in the economy today, especially here in the US, and making those middle managers individual contributors. And we just rather hire an older employee who needs less feedback and development than to hire one that's going to require more. And we structurally, because of our work arrangements, are in a situation where we can't, do that well.
It's a safer hire, right? And I think
Yeah, exactly.
that's the reality is that when we're in a period of some workforce transformation, figuring out human capital and technological capital, unfortunately, the earliest in career folks are kind of bearing the brunt of this. But it does seem like there's a pretty clear correlation between the unemployment trend for young workers and these workforce arrangements. So That's obviously a really strong case for more in-person work, or at least more hybrid work, where there's a bit of both in creating meaningful opportunities. And the other side to this is something we talk about all the time, is just like the societal impact of remote work, and what advice we would give to our own children if they were coming up in the world on what to look for in a new job. And how I think we both have really positive experiences from being early in career, having mentors, and building those early in career skills that have obviously been really useful for us. And unfortunately, as I stand now more mid career, the things that we did in our early 20s had a pretty big impact on us.
Exactly. And I think one of the things I come back to, like, what's the solution here? If you're a Gen Z person who just graduated or recently graduated looking for a job and struggling to find one, I mean, part of it, I think you'd be hopeful and say like, companies are going to change. And that may be true, but I don't know if you want to leave your fate in the trends of a bunch of companies here in the US. I think the alternative would be like maybe convincing yourself that like on-site work is like really valuable. And if you're an employee, if you're a Gen Z person who goes, I'm willing and excited about being in the office like 5 days a week, I bet you're applying to roles and jobs that are just getting far fewer resumes and are far less competitive than someone who's looking for like a fully remote job, right? And the final point maybe I would kind of put on like the argument for remote work, not from the employer perspective, right? So just looking at the employee or the Gen Z person, there's this professor at Stanford named Nick Bloom. He's kind of famous. I think he's famous, right? I don't know. In my world, maybe he is. He was researching remote work before COVID. So you imagine when COVID hit and everyone went remote, plus being the professor at Stanford, that is enough to like put you on like on CNN and MSNBC and all like the major news. He became like a somewhat of a celebrity. And like I've always struggled with some of Nick Bloom's content because like I think he's being, and understandably so, like he tells both sides of the story. He would say, yeah, it's remote work's great for flexibility and all the things you want to do, but you lose out development. So he's kind of talking about the pros and cons, and it's certainly like an intellectual conversation that warrants pros and cons. But at some point, you probably just need to like pick a side, maybe. And he normally doesn't do that. And like he was on a podcast I was listening to one time. This is like a year ago, maybe even longer. And the podcaster was trying to get him to like take a side, and he just like cut him off and said, do you have kids? He's like, yeah, I have 4 kids. How old are they? One was in like a junior, like a fairly late in their college career. And he goes, what advice do you give your daughter, right? Because the advice you give your daughter is typically what you really believe, right? Versus like, yeah, exactly. And so his advice that he was giving his daughter was find a company that's full-time on site 5 days a week and choose that company. And I thought, there you go. If you're thinking about what he wants for his daughter, which is the development, their success, like really their growth, right? As they kind of enter into the next chapter of their life, he's thinking the best options 5 days a week. And not to say that that's what you should pursue as an individual, but I think it's worth noting that this is just not something that employers are doing strictly for their benefit, right? I think it's easy to say that, and there's a dynamic between labor and capital and employers, but there is an element of being on site that is beneficial that you would give your child or your daughter to pursue.
And there's generational differences, right? I mean, remote work gave some people certainly a better quality of life. Those maybe elder millennials or Gen Xers who would just prefer and have the capability to work remotely, efficiently, and that doesn't impact their job prospects or anything like it has. Certainly, kind of been offloaded onto this generation that's entering the workforce, and they obviously didn't really get a vote on that. So certainly feels like, again, from a societal standpoint and just how employers think about workforce arrangements, equity is certainly something that is hopefully top of mind for them all, and it feels like some sort of hybrid model that maybe over time skews even more towards more on-site time is something that would deliver kind of fairness and equal opportunities for all generations in the workforce.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap up for today. Thanks as always for those who tune in. You can get your Wellable weekly podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, really wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to Willable Weekly for all of our latest insights. Thank you.